Hello, I'm Gwen Hill from Pine Ridge Baptist Church Sunday School Department, ladies class, and we are studying the book of Exodus. We're on chapter 4 this morning. Our last talk, our lesson, we were on chapter 3. Just a little review for you about where Moses, who is our main character, where he's at when the beginning of chapter 4. He is still on the mountain. He is talking to the burning bush. The voice coming from within that bush to him is God himself. A God who hasn't really, that we know of, spoken to his people in over 400 years. And a God that Moses and his brethren would have heard about in their oral history classes as they recited all the things that has happened from Genesis 1 up until today. That's the way they kept their oral history alive. So he knows about Abraham's God, Jacob's God, Isaac's God, but now he himself knows no one who has ever spoke to this God and been spoke back to as he is. This is a miraculous thing, and it's almost comical to watch and to listen Moses and God on high have this conversation, and how natural it flows and how easy it flows. It's amazing. How would you respond to this burning bush that was not consumed, to this voice of God coming from this bush? Exodus 4, we'll start with 1 and 2. Then Moses answered. God has told him he's going to send him to free the Hebrew children from slavery in Egypt. And he just can't imagine it. Moses cannot imagine it. Then Moses answered and said, "But suppose they will not believe me or listen to my voice. Suppose they say, 'The Lord has not appeared to you.'" Now, who's he talking about when he say they will not believe? He's talking about the Hebrew people in Egypt, the slaves themselves. The leaders of each family's tribe. If he goes in to tell them, "I am going to be the one to deliver you out of Egypt," why should they believe him? Why would they? And suppose they don't. God has given him some ideas, and he says, but suppose they don't. Does that little word "suppose" ever get you into a problem? I better not do that. Suppose I get sick. I better not do that. Suppose something happens. I don't think I ought to do that. I suppose somebody else out there with more experience and more knowledge comes forth. I wouldn't want to hinder them taking this. And he's supposing that he will be denied, that anyone would think that he could accomplish anything. That first 40 years of his life, he had many dreams that he would be the deliverer of his people. That's what he wanted to be. And then when his impetuosity and when his temper got the best of him and he killed a man and he had to run for his life, he's had 40 years to become a very humble man and to realize that without God's help, he can't deliver himself, much less anybody else. And he's had a pretty hard 40 years, this last 40 years. He lived with it every day that he considered himself a failure. And here God is calling him. And he just can't. He can't see himself in that role. So the Lord said to him in verse 2, "What's in your hand?" And he said, "A rod." A shepherd had two main tools. He had a rod and a staff. Do you know the difference? The rod was like 3 foot long. He wore it at the side of his garment on his dominant hand side so that it would be really fast, really easy, really accessible to him should he need to use it to defend himself or his flock against a bear, a lion, wolves, whatever. He had it there. It would have been a hefty piece of wood that he had worked on till it was polished at the handle where he held on to it. There was no splinters there. He could swing that booger and it wouldn't be rough in his hand. It was one that he would have practiced many, many times with the swing and the speed and the strength of the speed that he wanted to use to defend his flock. Something very, very comfortable to him. A defensive piece of material. The second thing he always had with him was a staff. The staff we're familiar with from Christmas cards and the shepherds and the crook on the top. What they normally did was they got a young tree, they bent it over, and when the tree grew in that shape and grew to the diameter they wanted, they cut it down, and they took the bark off and they polished it and worked with it till it was very, very comfortable in their hands. And they used the crook to reach out to get lambs or sheep and pull them back if they were straying too close to the side of a cliff, or getting out too deep in the water, or just wandering off. He would pull them back with that. That was not, that was a corrective stick, but not a punitive stick. It was a protection for them, a teaching tool for the sheep. It's best to stay with the shepherd. So he had those two, but the one he told that he had with him to the Lord that was speaking to him, he said, "That's what have you got in your hand?" Normally he wouldn't have had the defensive thing, the rod in his hand. He would have had the staff in his hand because it also was his walking stick, if you will. Some versions of the Bible say staff, some say rod. The New King James and the King James, I'm using the New King James now, say rod. If you look at the Orthodox Jewish Bible, the word used there can be interpreted either one, as a rod or as a staff. I haven't seen your moment. So I don't know which it is. I think we need to look at the use, where that word is falling, as to whether or not we want to think of it as he's talking about the rod here. He's talking about the staff here. Jesus, or the Lord, told him, this voice told him in verse 3, he said, "Cast it to the ground." And so he cast it, the rod, onto the ground, and it became a serpent, and Moses fled from it. I would have too. I don't like snakes. And then the Lord said to Moses, "Reach out your hand and take it by the tail." And he reached out his hand, he caught it, and it became a rod in his hand, that they may believe that the Lord God of their fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has appeared to you. This was a manifestation that he could use to prove, to validate his call from God on high, that he could take his rod, turn it into a snake, and then turn it back into a rod. You've heard about the Egyptian magicians doing a trick very similar to this, but that's the key word. It's a trick for them. This is an actual happening for Moses. God is showing him to take an inanimate piece of wood, create it into a living flesh and blood being, and then turn it back into wood again. With the Egyptians, they started out with a live snake that they put under a trance, and then they could reach down, and while that snake was in a trance, they could pick it up, and then they could lay it back down, and it would be as stiff as a rod, and then they could lay it back down, and it woke it up, and it would slither off and be a snake again, which it never ceased being a snake. They just lifted it up and down. Snakes, remember snake in the Garden of Eden? Stands for Satan, doesn't it? How many of you have ever seen a picture of the headgear that the pharaohs used? They had a serpent's head that come out the front of their helmet like that. This has a dual meaning too, that it would help. They're going to show how to defeat the Pharaoh. He's going to show how to defeat Satan. And he's also telling Moses, showing Moses, you need to conquer your fears. You can through me. Afraid of that snake? Reach down there and get it by its tail and pick it up. And Moses did. Most of the time, my dad told me that most of the time you're going to catch a snake, you need to catch a snake behind its head so that it can't bite you. You pick it up by its tail, you're more apt to get bit. Moses picked it up. And I think he was amazed as himself. As soon as he picked up that tail, it became his rod again. And the Lord said, you're worried about them believing you, that you came from me? Show them this. Show them that you have the power of Almighty God. Verse 6 and 7. Furthermore, the Lord said to him, now, put your hand in your bosom. And he put his hand in his bosom, and when he took it out, behold, his hand was leprous, like snow. And he said, put your hand in your bosom again. So he put his hand in his bosom again and drew it out of his bosom, and behold, it was restored just like his other flesh. Leprosy is a horrific, we call it Hansen's disease now. And it was a terrible blight to those people then. It was a viral condition, this disease, and it attacked the nervous system. At first, they would see white blotches on their skin, and they would notice that those white blotches had no feeling or decreased feeling. And the longer they had it, then that area became numb. If you have numb areas on your body, they can easily be damaged because you don't have the sensation of pain. And it's horrible. The next part of that disease is it would not only encroach on the nerves, but it would hinder the transmission of blood to that area. It would be diminished, and without blood, if a part of your body, a finger, a hand, doesn't have blood flow to it, it becomes dark, and then it rots away, and you may be wanting to wave bye-bye to somebody and your fingers fly off because they're dead. They're dead. It was horrible. These people lived in great distress because they were ostracized through fear. Moses would have been just like any other person in his day and time. He would have feared leprosy. This was something that no man on earth had a cure for at this time. And when he put his hand inside his cloak and he brought it out, he would have recognized in a heartbeat what was wrong with his hand. And it would have struck his heart and his mind with abject fear for just a moment. And God would have seen that. God would have felt that for him. And he said, Moses, put it back in your cloak. And Moses would have put his hand back in. Now draw it out again. And now it's clean. Our God has control not over life and inanimate objects, but over disease processes as well. He's the great physician. He takes care of all of our ills. He knows how they all operate and what can prevent them and what can cure them. And he continues in verse 8. He said, then it will be, if they don't believe you or heed the message of the first sign, you've got a second sign. He says that they may believe the message of the latter sign. And it shall be, if they do not believe even these two signs or listen to your voice, that you shall take water from the river and pour it on dry land, and the water which you take from the river will become blood on the dry land. Moses is listening intently. He is wanting to commit to memory every word he hears coming out of this bush, this God. He wants to remember, wouldn't you? Sure he is. But God just used a phrase here that is going to be running circles in his brain for just a few minutes. He said, if they won't believe the two signs or listen to your voice, you shall take water and pour it on dry land. He's hearing that about his voice. He is putting this together in his heart and his mind, and he's saying, I don't believe these people will accept what I'm telling them for the truth. I don't think I have the authority quite yet. God says, I'm going to give you the authority. You need a sign. Here's your one. And he showed him the snake sign, how to operate in the world of sign, symbolism. He said, and if that didn't work, I'll show you how to show them that your God has the power over nature and over their health. And he said, I'll give you another one. I'll give you another one. He said, you get a glass of the Nile River, the water in the Nile River. And he said, the Nile represents life for the Egyptians. The Nile is precious. The Nile is important. The Nile is their lifeblood. It is Egypt. If they didn't have the Nile, they wouldn't have an Egypt. He said, I want you to take that water and I want you to pour it onto the sand. When the liquid hits the sand, it's going to be a puddle of blood. I'm going to turn that life-giving source into blood. That will convince them that you're talking from me. Who is Moses trying to convince? Now, don't lose sight of this, because we know from prior studies what's going to happen. But Moses doesn't know that yet. Who Moses is striving to convince that he is talking from God himself, from the great I Am, are the Hebrew children, his own people, his own family, his own brothers. So let's go to verse 10. Lack of communication skills. Remember I said he would be thinking about that. That's running around in the back of his head if they don't listen to your words. So let's go to verse 10. Then Moses said to the Lord, "Oh my Lord, I am not eloquent, neither before nor since you have spoken to your servant, but I am slow of speech and slow of tongue." So the Lord said to him, "Who has made man's mouth? Or who made the mute, the deaf, the seeing, or the blind? Have not I, the Lord? Now therefore go, and I will be with your mouth, and I will teach you what you shall say." Moses is thinking, he's saying, oh goodness, I've got to talk the Lord out of this, that he's not chosen the right man. I can't speak eloquently. None of the commentators that I've read can find a definitive answer for why Moses said this. There's a lot of ideas. One of the ideas is that he had a lisp or a stutter. Both, especially a stutter, has been related to a psychological problem. But whatever it was, whether it was, I've not spoken Egyptian in 40 years. I have a terrible case of stage fright. Anytime I'm going to talk in front of people, I get very nervous. I don't know what his problem is, but it was very real to Moses. But God said, do you think I don't know that, Moses? Do you think I don't know your problems? Do you think I don't know your challenges? Do you think that I have forgotten how I made you? I know every cell in your body, Moses. I know everything you're capable of. Moses, I'm going to go with you. I'm going to be with your mouth. I am going to make sure that you say the right thing, that you do the right thing. Moses, you're going to be my mouthpiece. You won't have to worry about that. I got you, buddy. I got you. But you know what? We do the same thing. We think we can't teach that Sunday school class because we're not smart enough. Boy, I'm proof that that's not true. I can't sing that song for the Lord because I can't sing in public. It makes me too nervous. I can't take that job. I can't witness to that person. I'm afraid. And we forget exactly what God has told Moses here. He is telling us as well. If I call you to it, I'll make sure you're equipped. I'll be right there with you. And I will support you. And I will help you. That's the God that we serve. You know that? But Moses was being stubborn. Very stubborn. Up until this point, he has not sinned. It's not a sin to question God. It's not a sin to ask God questions. But you know what? When God point blank tells us something that he wants us to do and we stand flat-footed and tell him no, then you can't call him Lord. He's not your Lord. Lord means that you're going to do what that person says. There's no such thing as I won't to your Lord, or he's not your Lord. We're going to see Moses sin right here. He hasn't sinned up to this point on this mountaintop with this burning bush. He has not sinned in his exchanges with God, the great I am, up until now. But listen, verse 13. But he, Moses, said, "Oh, my Lord, please send by the hand of whomever else you may send." He's saying, no, Lord, send anybody else but me. Don't send me. What you're hearing is desperation, a plea from Moses. This man who is greatly educated, this man who is a prime physical specimen, this man is overcome with fear and dread. And he has allowed Satan to sow the seed that he is not enough till he sins. He said, "No, Lord. Please send by the hand of whomever else you may send. Don't send me, anybody else but me." In verse 14. So the anger of the Lord was kindled against Moses, and he said, "Is not Aaron the Levite your brother? I know that he can speak well. And look, he is also coming out to meet you. When he sees you, he'll be glad in his heart. Now you shall speak to him, and put the words in his mouth, and I will be with your mouth and with his mouth, and I will teach you what you shall do." He said, "Moses, you're not going to be able to have the blessing that I had prepared for you. You've got a brother. Aaron. And just like I know your mouth, I know Aaron's mouth. And Aaron can talk. He can talk in public, and he can talk with good diction, and he's a smart man. So I'm going to have him help you. But this is the way it's going to be. I'm going to tell you what I want, and you have to tell Aaron. I will direct both of you. But the one that I will speak the most to will be to you. And you will have to have Aaron speak in your behalf and in my behalf. You will do the signs and wonders. But Aaron will be the spiritual leader. He will go down as the first priest. He had intended Moses to be the first priest. Exodus 4:16 through 18. So he shall be your spokesman to the people, and he himself shall be a mouth for you, and you shall be to him as God. And you shall take this rod in your hand with which you shall do the signs. He said, Moses, I'll make Aaron the mouthpiece. But I'm talking to you. It is your responsibility to make sure that Aaron understands what he is to say and when he is to say it. Verse 18. So Moses went and returned to Jethro, his father-in-law, and said to him, please let me go and return to my brethren who are in Egypt and see whether they are still alive. And Jethro said to Moses, go in peace. Look at this man who we said last week was very contented. He's very respectful. He still lives within the compound of his father-in-law, and he goes, gathers up his wife and his 2 children, and he doesn't leave by dark of night. He has the courage to go to Jethro and say, I need to go back to Egypt. I need to check on my family. And I think part of Jethro is thinking, what's taking you so long, son? What's taking you so long? So he begins his mission. But is he ready? Verse 19. And the Lord said to Moses in Midian, go, return to Egypt, for all the men who sought your life are dead. I don't know if Moses knew before now that the Pharaoh that had wanted him put to death because he had killed the Egyptian overseer, I don't know that if he knew that Pharaoh was dead or not, but now the Lord discloses to him and confirms to him, all the people who sought your death some 40 years ago, they themselves are dead now. You don't have to worry about them. You don't have to be concerned about them. One of the laws in Egypt at this time was, if I was wanted for a crime in that area, for whatever, and the Pharaoh had put a price on my head, had wanted me to pay for that crime, when that Pharaoh, or if that Pharaoh died before I was captured and brought in for justice, then all charges were dropped. I was given leniency. The crime was expunged, and I was no longer a criminal in court. So that's what's happened here. So I kind of like that Moses possibly decided, well, I'm going to have to do what the Lord says. And he took a deep breath, grabbed up his rod and his staff and his family and said, we're going back to face the music. And now he finds out that he's not a political enemy anymore. So he took his wife and his sons, and he set them on a donkey, and he returned to the land of Egypt, and Moses took the rod of God in his hand. So Moses is, I think here in this particular place, it means his staff, because he has it in his hand, and they use that as a walking stick as well. The staff they use as walking stick. In verse 21, and the Lord said to Moses, when you go back to Egypt, see that you do all those wonders before Pharaoh, which I have put in your hand. But I will harden his heart, so that he will not let the people go. Then you shall say to Pharaoh, thus saith the Lord, Israel is my son, my firstborn. So I say to you, let my son go, that he may serve me. But if you refuse to let him go, indeed I will kill your son, your firstborn. All right. Moses is on his way back to Egypt. He knows the job that is before him, that he's going to be confronting first his own people. And now God is telling him, they are going to accept you. The next big step will be talking to the Pharaoh himself. And I want you to be ready, Moses. The wonders that I gave you to convince the Israelis, the Hebrew children, that I sent you, you're going to have to use those to convince Pharaoh. Get ready. This would have been a time of anxiety for Moses. He says, when you go back, I will harden his heart. My God knows what I'm going to say before I say it. Have you ever said something to someone, you say, oh, I knew you'd say that? I knew you'd do that. I knew it. When my little girl, was only like 4 years old, now about 3 to 4 years old, we were at a family gathering. Not my daughter, my granddaughter. We were at a family gathering, and she was tired and she wanted to go home, but her mom and daddy were enjoying the company that was there. And I knew this little granddaughter wanted to go home, wanted to go somewhere quiet, and wanted to rest. She was tired. It was in the evening hours. And her grandfather thinks that the sun rose and set in that little girl. So my mother and my aunt and I were standing watching from probably 25, 30 feet away. And I got down in Julia's little earshot and I said, honey, you want to go home? Yes, Grandma. I said, all right, you do this. You go over to Papa and you put your hands on his knee. Don't say a word. Just put your hands on his knees. He's talking, so you don't interrupt. Just put your hand on his knees. He will continue to talk, but he'll look down at you, and then he will pick you up and set you in his lap. And I said, you sit there quietly for just a little while. And I said, then you take your little hand and you put it on Papa's cheek when he stops talking. And I said, and he'll look down at you. And when he looks down at you, you say, Papa, I won't go home. And I said, then he will stand up. And he will look at your mother and your daddy, and he'll say, we're going to go on to the house, and if you don't care, we'll take Julia with us. She's tired and wants to go somewhere where it's quiet. And they'll say, sure. And I said, then we'll leave. And that is exactly what happened. I mean, down to a T. I wasn't some miracle worker. I just knew how much that man loved that little girl. And I knew she could follow directions. And I knew his heart. I didn't make him do that. I didn't make her do that. You know what? God knows exactly what you're going to do and what you're going to say. He doesn't make you say it. You have a free will. But he knows what you're doing, what you're thinking, and how you're going to respond. And so he says, he's not going to let him go. And I'm going to harden his heart. You know, there's a piece of scripture that says God will not scribe with men forever. Sooner or later, we reach the end of the rope. The Lord just feeds us out a little bit at a time, and he wants us to do what he tells us to. But if we say no long enough and often enough to him, pretty soon he says that is enough, and he will withdraw from us and will not present those doors to us again. He'll harden our hearts. You never know when it's the last time God is going to ask you to do something for him, and you say no until he says, okay. You won't get that opportunity again. I'll see to it. You're that adamant, you've had your chances. So he brings up about the firstborn. Israel is his people. He is their God. And he's going to make Pharaoh accept that. Verse 24, 25, and 26 are some of the strangest verses in Scripture. I'll tell you how I think it went. And if you disagree, that's just fine. Read the verses. Pray about these verses. Think about these verses. They're very intriguing. Okay, verse 24. Chapter 4, verse 24. And it came to pass on the way at the encampment that the Lord met him and sought to kill him. Moses was on his way to Egypt. It was more than a one-day trip. They stopped at an encampment to rest, to get ready for the next journey, next leg of the journey. And God seeks to kill Moses. And Zipporah, her name means little wren, little bird, took a sharp stone, a flint, and cut off the foreskin of her son and cast it at Moses' feet and said, surely you are a husband of blood to me. So he let him go. And then she said, you are a husband of blood because of the circumcision. Why did God want to kill Moses? It was because again, my interpretation, to be the leader that he needed to be to these people, he needed to uphold the very things that he's going to be asking them to do. He's not going to be one of these leaders that says, do as I say, but not as I do. He has to fulfill the law himself, the requirements that the Lord wants. And one of the requirements was circumcision. Evidently, it is thought that he circumcised his first son, but he did not his second son. They suppose that Zipporah was appalled at the circumcision and had such a fit about it that Moses said when the second was born, well, you can have your way, I won't do it. But whenever the Lord decided that this was a big enough offense, he knew, Zipporah knew why the Lord was so angry with Moses. Moses knew. I don't know how, but she did. So she took up a piece of flint. I have a piece of flint right here. It's a piece of rock, flint rock, got a sharp edge on it. She grabbed up a piece of flint and she circumcised her son. And she took that foreskin and she threw it either on or at Moses' feet. And the Lord was satisfied at that point that Moses didn't have that sign of reproach and he couldn't be attacked because of it as a leader of the Israeli children. You know, Sapphira loved Moses. I don't know that I could have done what she did, but she couldn't stand by and see Moses killed or die. She intervened. She's a strong woman. She may have been a little woman, but she was mighty. And though it was an abhorrent act to her, she committed it to save her husband's life, to bring Moses into obedience. Ooh, did you hear that child howl in the background? Did you see the looks on Zipporah's face for the next 3 days as they traveled into Egypt? There is a commentary that I've just discovered within the last 2 weeks, and it's Wiersbe Bible Commentary, Wiersbe Bible Commentary. You might want to read their account of this. It's really quite interesting how they explain Zipporah's obedience and Moses' neglect to circumcise his son. But before Moses even arrived in Egypt, he knew he had a battle on his hands. It wouldn't be easy to convince Pharaoh to let the people go, but he's ready. Verse 27, 28, and 29. And the Lord said to Aaron, go in the wilderness to meet Moses. So he went, met him in the mountain of God, and he kissed him. So Moses told Aaron all the words of the Lord that had sent him and all the signs which he had commanded him. Then Moses and Aaron went and gathered together the elders of the children of Israel. And Aaron spoke all the words which the Lord had spoken to Moses. Then he did the signs in the sight of the people. And the people believed. And when they heard that the Lord had visited the children of Israel and that he had looked on their affliction, then they bowed their heads and they worshiped. Isn't it sweet when you see a sibling you haven't seen or a really good friend you haven't seen in a long time? It's been 40 years since these brothers had met. How joyous it would have been. The questions they would have had. Is Mom and Daddy still alive? How are you doing? Oh, meet my wife and my children. Now let's talk. God has spoken to you, Aaron? Yes. Let's talk about what the great I Am has said. How they've shared the word back and forth and how they've repeated it. How they've prayed. How they've asked for guidance. And these two went back side by side walking back to Egypt and gathering up the elders of the people, the leaders of each tribe, and they told them that God loved them and God had deemed it time to draw them out of slavery and back to Canaan. Aaron was the spokesman. Moses was the one who did the wonders, and they believed. And it was such a relief that God was listening to them, hearing them, and that now this God, after a long silence to them, was now going to act on their behalf. These men who had never been free wonder at their excitement. Can you hear it? They had never been free. They had always been slaves of Egypt. They wanted relief. They wanted freedom. However, freedom is not cheap. It comes at a high cost. And we're going to study that next week. I hope you have a good day, good evening, good night.